Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The debate over the U.S. defense budget is quite heated, while not creating much light. Why does the U.S. need such a vast military-industrial complex? Who or what actually threatens American security? Is the real debate, if not battle, over who garners vast profits at taxpayer expense? To CrossTalk defense spending, I'm joined by my guest in Washington, Anthony Schaefer. He is a director for external communications at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Douglas McGregor, he is a retired Army colonel, author, and independent businessman. And Kelly Vlahos, she is a journalist at antiwar.com. All right, folks, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Kelly, if I can go to you first, what is one fact that is not focused enough on in this debate, and what's the biggest myth about defense spending?
Well, I'd say the one fact that's not focused enough on in this debate is the fact that we are in a natural downturn anyway, having got out of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So we're headed for a 20 to 30% drop in defense spending anyway. That's natural. What the sequester has done, it is forcing the Defense Department to take a hatchet to the budget. And so it is allowing Defense Department executives to avoid the real thoughtful, smart cuts that should occur anyway. And now we see a lot of grandstanding. So the first to go will be, employees that are forced to go on a furlough. And we're looking at serious drops in family pay right now, when we should be looking at the expenditures across the board that reflect the bloat and waste and abuse in the Defense Department as is. So I think the biggest thing that is being overlooked here is that the politicians are allowed to grandstand because of this sequester, when we should be going into a natural downturn anyway.
Okay, Tony,
in defense spending.
Tony, what do you think about it? It's a natural downturn, but you don't get that idea from inside the Beltway.
Well, it's not a downturn when you really come down to the numbers. Even with sequester, should it kick in this Saturday, we're still talking about a 2.3 to 2.4% growth for DOD. This is one of those great Washington games. We're not actually talking about cuts. We're talking about cuts in the percentage of growth. So what you're seeing here, as I said in the New York Post, a Washington Post article, is that you're seeing political theater. This whole idea that we're not deploying the Truman Battle Group because of quote-unquote cuts is insane. The monies used for operations, O&M budgets, are not being cut remotely, and the bottom line is this, as always, the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq were paid for by emergency funds. My goodness sake, if the Navy actually needs to continue its operations, it can always go to Congress and ask for emergency appropriations. So we're not even there yet. This is all theater, and it's not even good theater at this point in time.
Okay, Doug, theater. Okay, but it seems like bad theater to me. Go ahead.
Well, it is. It's very disappointing, but we shouldn't be surprised. Sequestration is really a measure of the level of political cowardice that we have inside the Beltway. No one wants to tell the American people the truth, which is we have this crushing debt. We've got to ultimately reduce the size of our government and reduce spending across the boards. We're at least 20 years overdue for fundamental change in the way we organize our forces to defend the United States. And we're at the end of more than 10 years of failed, disastrous interventions that have ultimately cultivated more enemies and cost trillions of dollars. So you put it all together, and we're not at the end of this process. We're just at the beginning of dramatic cuts in federal spending, and that includes defense. We will ultimately cut. This is not a serious cut, as Tony has pointed out, but we're at the beginning of that process.
Okay, Kelly, but I thought the United States would be insecure that our enemies will come against us because of this. That's what you read in mainstream media. Go ahead. Well,
no, and I think most people know by this point that the United States spends more than the next 13 countries combined on defense spending per year. And let's keep in mind that if sequestration goes through, which would, combined with the cuts that went into effect or supposedly go into effect last year, about $1 trillion over the next 10 years, that would only bring our spending levels down to about the 2007 levels, which at that point we were waging a two-front war. So there's a lot of hyperbole going on in terms of what the disaster is on the horizon. And I think that Tony had pointed out that there's been a lot of rhetoric about pulling ships in from the Gulf, a lot of rhetoric about not being able to get flight time training, personnel would be pulled back. And I think that's part of the kabuki theater. But when we look at it on the spending trajectory, this sequestration would only take us back to 2007 levels, and I think that most of us around this table would agree that we weren't hurting back in 2007 in terms of our readiness.
Right. So, Tony, this is really all about money. It's not about defense, right?
Right. Well, as we know from education, simply throwing money at education doesn't make people smarter. Simply throwing money at
the military doesn't make you smarter either.
We need an effective defense. That's right. We need an effective defense, not an expensive defense. And this is the key. I mean, when you look at other spending, let's take China, for example. One of the rhetorical points here is that, oh, my goodness, the Chinese are spending more on their defense. But they don't look at the entire picture. For example, the Chinese are spending as much in researching and trying to support sources of potable water. Just think about this. They're spending as much on trying to find water for their people as they are on defense. So if you look at it in context, they're not really doing anything extraordinary. They're a very large country. So this is where I think we have these half-truths put out there to justify bad behavior. So this is where, again, we have to look at what the real threats are. And as Doug said, I would fundamentally say we need to relook everything from the National Security Act of 1947 on. We are structured to fight a Cold War, which ended in 1990. So this is time now. And of course, the other thing is, as Kelly was talking about, we haven't even done accountability of the money we've spent. The Pentagon refuses to do an actual audit. So you don't even know where the money is going that you have spent. So how can you justify not spending money that you do have for things you know you must do? It's truly insane.
Okay, Doug, so who's running the show? The Pentagon, Congress, the American people? Who?
Well, I think at the moment we have to say that it's a combination of 4 stars in the Department of Defense and people on the Hill who are, of course, tied to people in industry who are interested in maintaining the money flow for big-ticket items. Look, here's a serious problem that no one bothers to discuss, and I think your viewers will appreciate knowing this. During the Second World War, when we had 11 million men in the Air Force and the Army, we had only 4 4-star generals to command that force. Today, we have about 880,000 men in the Army and the Air Force combined, and we have 23 4-star generals. What we've got is this enormous bloat in senior officers that came about during the Cold War as we multiplied the numbers of headquarters. We have a similar bloat when it comes to the price tags of big-ticket items in the defense industry. It has been a feeding frenzy in Washington for money since the mid-90s, and the last 10 years have only made it worse. So we have an entitlement culture that says, first of all, we deserve to have all of these headquarters, we deserve to have all of this money, and anyone who challenges us is essentially unpatriotic. And by the way, here are all the grossly inflated threats that you're paying to defend against. It's all nonsense. It's all going to end because fiscal reality is beginning to intrude.
Okay, Kelly, you wrote an article about the revolving door, industry in the Pentagon. I mean, this is what also drives it, of course.
Absolutely. I think the American people would be appalled to realize that the state of things in the Pentagon today. I think that, one example, after Undersecretary Carter Ash got on television last week and he said sequestration would cause us to have to pull back our ships, it would cause us to not be ready for other wars, quote unquote, it would cause us to stop training, flight times would be pulled back. I think that was, it sent a real alarm bell to the American people, as though we would not be able to fight a war. Well, if this sequestration goes through, the next day we see in the news that the F-35 is costing this government the untried and fairly flawed F-35 is going to cost the government, or has cost it, $440 billion. And the juxtaposition, and as Doug mentioned, between our big ticket items, the spending on those items, the fact that these major defense companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, all get about 80% of their revenues from the federal government. They are living off the federal dole. Their best interest is to make sure they have an army of lobbyists up on Capitol Hill every day, fighting for their pet projects, for their budgets, in essence. Now, these lobbyists are basically people who have worked on the Hill. They hire them right off the Hill. And then they turn and they hire our generals, our retired generals and admirals. So we see this secular situation where we have retired military, we have people staff straight off the congressional committees, the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committees, who are going into the lobbying squads of these major defense contractors.
All right, let me jump in. I want to go to Tony before we go to the break here. Let me go to Tony before we go to the break here. So what we just heard was America's biggest welfare program.
Absolutely, and that's one of the issues. I mean, when the Super Committee had Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania and Patty Murray from Washington State, both senators from different parties, both having Boeing as part of their constituency, I predicted the Super Committee would fail because neither side wanted to actually see that welfare stop.
I want you to finish that thought after our short break.
Right.
And after our short break, we'll continue our discussion on defense spending. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the U.S. defense budget. Okay, Tony, I'd like to go back to you. Don't you think maybe in the longer term this crisis, quote-unquote crisis, is a good idea because it makes people more fiscally responsible? Because that's the only thing that threatens the United States itself.
Well, I'd like to believe that. The problem is, like I said, General Eisenhower warned us in his closing speech about the military-industrial congressional complex, and that's why I was mentioning before the break. Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, Democrat, Pat Toomey, Republican senator from Pennsylvania, both have Boeing as a commonality. So you got people who actually are more worried about their reelection than what's best for the American people, because when they sat on the Super Committee, I predicted they wouldn't actually do anything productive to actually rein in these issues regarding the defense side of the House. With that said, Boeing is actually the most creative of the super contractors because they actually had Dennis Muhlenberger, the president, comment that the fact that they're going to basically accept that they have to cut. And therefore, as a productive company producing aircraft, they're going to take some of the military side folks and convert them to the civilian side, to the commercial side, which really is the right thing to do. We should have all contractors doing that sort of thing. Instead, they're digging their heels in, as Doug stipulated, and as Kelly stipulated. And all they're trying to do is basically lobby the Hill to continue the gravy train at the expense of all else.
Okay, Doug, this seems like a national security threat to me. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, look, you just said something before Tony spoke that's very important. You talked about leveraging this fiscal and economic crisis to do some things that make sense. You're absolutely on target. That's what needs to happen now. What we need to do is to go in and perform surgery, to identify the capabilities we need today and begin to cultivate capabilities we will need in the future. That means changing the structure, the organization of the national defense establishment. That means finally building a national defense strategy.
Doug,
who's no
do
national
this?
military
Doug,
strategy.
Who's going to do this, though? The Pentagon?
Well, I think the Congress within the next 6 to 12 months is going to be so absorbed in the domestic crisis that is coming as a result of our fiscal irresponsibility. We are well on the road to Greece and Italy. That the next Secretary of Defense and the President will have quite a free hand to make rather profound change in the military establishment. The question is, will they do it? Or will they simply cut away incrementally and leave us with effectively a hollow military establishment, one with lots of generals, admirals, and headquarters, not very many people that can actually fight, lots of chiefs, no Indians.
Kelly, is there any courage in Washington to do exactly what we just heard?
I'm not very confident that. I was talking with a senior Navy officer last night. You know, I just happened to be, I found myself in this conversation, and I asked about what the feeling was, and the feeling now is a lot of despondency, because I think within the military there is a strong contingent of officers, enlisted people who see the circus going on in Washington. And what they're concerned about is that the sequestration allows the Department of Defense to slash and burn at these places that really are more theatrical than they are helpful. So what they're talking about is the flurry of emails that on the civilian side and the active duty side saying that, talking about these furloughs. These furloughs are actually going to happen. And how that affects the active duty side is the active duty side is going to have to, is going to likely have longer deployments. So what we're hurting is the actual families and the service members and allowing the politicians and the lobbyists and the bureaucrats on the Hill to avoid all of these thoughtful changes and reforms that Doug was just talking about. So what really pains me is that we do have this window to actually make changes, but the politicians, the debate is allowing the theater to happen, and the only people that it is going to hurt, at least in the short term, are our service members. And I think Americans, given their druthers, would not want the service members, the health benefits, the veterans benefits to be the first thing on the chopping block. They would want the expensive, bloated, big-ticket items that Doug talked about first on the chopping block, the waste.
Tony, the world looks like it's turned upside down here. Okay, go ahead. Please jump in. Go ahead.
Could I jump in for 1 second and respond? Kelly has said something that's very important about deployments. An awful lot of our trouble stems from this thing we call presence. It's this assumption that is built into our military establishment that we need to have forces, air, land, and sea, everywhere all the time.
Everywhere.
That if we are not visible everywhere all the time, that the world will come apart, it will collapse into conflict. This is nonsense. And we've got to go back in and completely scale back this notion of presence. In fact, we can make a good case right now that the more visible American forces are, the more trouble we have in the world.
Tony, you were agreeing there. Go ahead, jump in.
If I could jump into, well, let me jump into Doug's quote. Yeah, I've Panetta, SecDef Panetta has been basically derelict in his duties because he is continuing what Doug is talking about, and they know on side of the Pentagon what's going on. Kelly's correct. The line officers know what's going on. The guys that actually have to do the work know that this is all nonsense, going to hurt them, because all the politicians, to include the freaking generals, Michael Schreier calls them politicians in uniform. That's what they've become. And frankly, you know, Panetta did this 5-point strategy put out on the 18th of December of last year, where he states, oh, we knew about sequestration, but we decided to do nothing. What, come on, are you kidding me? You should have been figuring the worst case scenarios to actually do the cuts of things that you don't need and can live without. Instead, they doubled down on this 5-point strategy, basically a status quo. And frankly, if I received this 5-point strategy that Panetta put out, if I received it from one of our interns at our think tank, I would have given him a freaking F. That's how bad it was. And it was very clear that Panetta, like others, are all about the status quo and not actually wanting to do the hard things of determining what threats we should focus on and then try to fund those threats. Instead, they don't want to do the hard work, as Doug pointed out.
You've got to where I want to be in this program. Kelly, who or what threatens the United States today, and how can the defense budget be justified?
Well, I think my friend Doug over there would say that we are our own greatest threat. Well, I think my colleagues on this panel would agree that we need a full-scale reassessment of our grand strategy, so to speak. Because right now we have this web where we have to parse out, where are the threats that we're actually causing by having this huge footprint across the globe? What are the actual threats? We have cybersecurity that has become the sort of cause du jour, another front in the global war on terror that we are pouring billions of dollars into right now, and that's a whole other discussion. Because a lot of the money, a lot of these contractors now, they're smart. They're shifting a lot of their resources over to cybersecurity right now because they know the money might not be there for some of these weapon systems and the contracting that they've done for the war. So I think our greatest threat right now, and I hate to be cheeky about it is, I think, is our lack of imagination, our lack of thought, our lack of intelligence when it comes to our grand strategy. Where are we going from here as a nation in our defense policy?
Doug, jump in. Who's America's greatest enemy right now?
Well, right now we have 40 million Americans on food stamps.
Okay.
Our economy is shrinking. People want to add 15 million illegals, low-skilled, low education, who will join the underclass if we allow that to happen. Our borders are open. They're not secure. We don't really know, legally or illegally, who's coming in regarding immigration. All of our problems are here inside the United States. When it comes to foreign threats, it's a long-term view that we need to take. Our principal interest is prosperity. We're an economic power. We need to regain that prosperity. That means we need access to markets. We need to trade with people. That means that we have a permanent interest that no one power or collection of powers dominate the Eurasian heartland. That's not very likely right now, and I don't think we're going to see anyone who wants to fight a major war, to be perfectly blunt, for at least 10 or 15 years. So what we can afford to do is scale back much of what we're doing right now and begin to think very carefully about the kinds of forces we will need over the long term. That's not happening, and that's where we have to think right now.
Tony, why isn't it happening? Because it isn't lucrative?
Well, no, that's a problem. I mean, there's certain threat areas, as Doug pointed out, that I think that we legitimately need to look at, but they're over the horizon, and we're not doing the hard work. Notably, during the ramp up to World War II, we did something called the Rainbow Plans. Plan Orange was one which we looked at regarding the contingency, the potential of the Japanese become a competitor, and basically we were ready to go in World War II because we actually looked at the long-term threats and tried to position ourselves to be there at the time we needed to. We're not doing that now. We're spending all this money on the status quo, on a Cold War infrastructure, and frankly, that's the issue. Is there a cyber threat? Absolutely. But they're only giving it lip service, and I know they're spending a lot of money, but not effectively. Keith Alexander, the current commander of Cyber Command, is probably the worst possible guy to be the commander because he doesn't understand the issue. And trust me, this is a critical issue. So we do have that as an issue, and it's far more likely that an American citizen is going to suffer a cyber event of some sort than be attacked or hurt by an al-Qaeda attack. We're completely spending money in the wrong areas. And a four-star general completely would back up what, that I talked to, a former commander of Central Command, would completely back up what Kelly said. He said in a meeting we had on Capitol Hill that the problem with our Defense Department is we have no grand strategy. So if you don't have a grand strategy, you fund everything and accomplish very little. And that's where we're at right now.
Okay, Kelly, I'm going to give you the last word on the program, 40 seconds. Where is this all going? What are we going to be saying a year from now?
Well, I think a year from now we're going to be saying, why didn't we have the smarts to cut away, the budget effectively? The majority of Americans, and these are polls running right up until yesterday, believe that we should cut spending, that the debt is important, and where should we cut? We should start with the Defense Department. So I think that the politicians ought to start listening to the American people, because next election they're going to come back and they're going to say, Why did you cut my pay? I'm a civilian defense worker.
Okay, I have to jump in here. We've run out of time. The general should be listening to you guys. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.